There's no two ways about it. As a Greek male, you would have been extremely bellicose. As soon as spring arrived and the dandelions popped up, you would have felt an irresistible urge to work off your testosterone. To reverse Clausewitz's famous dictum, politics for the Greeks was a continuation of war by other means. Probably most Greek communities were engaged in hostilities of some sort every year. In the case of the Athenians, there were often several theatres of war. As in the previous lecture, I'm going to be talking mainly about the Athenians and Spartans, the ones we know most about, and I'm also going to be talking mainly about the 5th century BC, the period that begins with the Persian Wars and ends with the Peloponnesian War. Those wars had momentous consequences for Greece. For the most part, however, the battles you fought were small and localized and did not change the balance of power in the Greek world. Every Greek community required its citizens to serve in the military. So I'm going to be talking about an aspect of daily life that was common to virtually every Greek male, and one, moreover, that dictated the rhythm of daily life. The Greeks regarded service in the military as a privilege, not a duty, and far less a chore. Service in the military was as much part of your political identity as was attendance at the assembly. This is something that is very difficult for us to understand. We, of course, have a professional army, and except under circumstances of dire emergency, most of us today wouldn't expect to have to fight for our country ever. We'd probably go to war much less frequently if we did. The Greeks, the Spartans apart, weren't professional soldiers at all. They were farmers, tradesmen, gentlemen of leisure, and so forth, who from 18 onwards were also members of a citizen militia. Being a conscientious objector wasn't an option. Even a philosopher like Socrates, not the most military of men one supposes, fought in 3 battles. As too, no doubt, did all the greatest intellects of the 5th century. The tragic poet Aeschylus, in the epitaph that he wrote himself, alludes proudly to the fact that he, quote, slew the long-haired Medes. That's another name for the Persians, at Marathon. He doesn't record anything about his accomplishments as a dramatist. As a Greek, you accepted the fact unquestioningly that you would put your own life, as well as the lives of your sons, in harm's way on a regular basis. Another thing that made serving in the Greek military so special was the fact that you served alongside your relatives and your neighbors. That's because mobilization was conducted on a tribal and thus regional basis. This again made the experience very different from what soldiers face today, since you would have known many of the people whom you were fighting alongside from birth upwards. In other words, serving in the Athenian military was a collective and civic undertaking, and this made a huge difference to what fighting for your country would have felt like. Finally, there weren't people back home criticizing the government for going to war while you put your life on the line, because it was you and the rest of the citizen body who had taken the decision to go to war in the first place. The Athenians weren't like the Spartans when it came to making war. In the famous funeral speech that the historian Thucydides puts into the mouth of Pericles at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, the statesman makes a pointed contrast between Athenians and Spartans. The Spartans, he says, are constantly training. We, on the other hand, I quote, have procured many ways to refresh our minds from toil by indulging in athletic contests and in annual sacrifices. In other words, we, unlike the Spartans, know how to kick back. So let's suppose you've just turned 18 and you come from a well-to-do family, a family that is with enough money to supply you with hoplite armour. Hoplite means a soldier armed with a hoplon. A hoplon is a round shield made of wood or stiffened leather with a bronze covering about 3 feet in diameter. You hold it in such a way as to protect about half of your body and half of the body of the man standing on your left. It goes without saying that hoplites have to be right-handed. You're also going to need a bronze corselet or breastplate, a bronze helmet, a pair of greaves, a thrusting spear about 8 feet long, and a short sword. The equipment of a hoplite was cutting edge in more sense than one. It's been plausibly suggested that the Athenian victory over the Persians at Marathon was partly due to the superiority of hoplite equipment. At 18, you're now required to serve for 2 years as an ephebe, that's to say, as a cadet. Ephebos means literally poised at the moment of youth. In your first year of service, you'll train both as a hoplite and as a light-armed warrior. That's to say, you'll learn to use not only a sword and a spear, but also a bow and a catapult. During your second year, you'll serve as a patrolman at forts situated along the borders of Attica. When you've completed your 2 years of training, you're liable at any time to be called up for military service. Typically, you'll be called up several times in your lifetime, as Socrates was. You'll learn that you've been called up when you read the relevant notice attached to the base of the monument to the eponymous heroes in the Athenian Agora. The eponymous heroes are the patrons of the 10 Athenian tribes into which the entire citizen body is divided, one hero for each tribe. The notice will also tell you how much food to bring with you, which was the same as telling you how long the campaign was expected to last. Mobilization is conducted on a tribal basis, and there will be a notice under the appropriate statute stating which age groups within your tribe are required to serve. Younger men obviously serve more frequently than older men, and as someone who has just completed his military training, your chances of being called up are very high. Even so, we know that men in their 40s and 50s commonly fought and died in battle. Rarely was the entire citizen body called up, however. It doesn't take much imagination to work out that the leave-taking between you and your family will be very poignant, as is the case with every leave-taking between soldiers and their families. Scenes of leave-taking are frequently depicted on Greek vases, indicating their centrality to the life of the family and the home. We see hoplites polishing their armour, donning it, and then bidding farewell. Occasionally there's a dog sniffing around. It obviously realizes something is up. The scenes are invariably restrained. You don't see people weeping, but they're highly charged nonetheless. And once you've left, your family won't hear any word of you till you return. Not for months, even perhaps years in some cases, as in the case of Odysseus' wife Penelope, which was like my mother's situation in World War II, made worse by the fact that she received a telegram telling her that her husband was missing, presumed dead. It wasn't true. He turned up at the end of the war, but in the meantime she'd fallen in love. It must have been common occurrence in antiquity. Hoplite battles usually took place on level ground, since that way you and your fellow hoplites could maintain order and discipline. First, however, your general would ask a seer to see whether the omens are favourable, and if the seer reports that they are, the general will give the order to join battle, and you'll march lockstep to the sound of pipes, singing a paean or a hymn to the god Apollo. You march in a rectangular formation known as a phalanx. A phalanx is a long battle line about 8 ranks deep, You take your stand directly opposite the enemy, who, if they're Greeks, are also drawn up in a phalanx formation. You engage by running towards the enemy, being careful to keep in battle formation. And at the moment of impact, it's like two tanks smashing into each other. Your objective is limited: to break through the enemy line en masse. In order to achieve this, you and your fellows have to stand your ground, and this meant that individual heroics are pretty much ruled out. There's no point breaking out of line, because all that does is to put the men fighting alongside you at risk, because they'll be unprotected. And remember that your shield partly protects the man on your left, so complicated maneuvers are rarely attempted. Generals don't play much of a part, so far as we can tell, since once you had engaged, you wouldn't have been able to hear their orders, as your helmet had no piercings for the ears. The noise that reverberates inside your helmet is intense and disorienting. Unless you're fighting in the front rank, you probably don't have much sense of how your side is doing. All you can see is the back of the man standing in front of you. You do a lot of jabbing at the unprotected parts of your enemy's body, especially above and below his shield, and you push hard with your shield. The battle probably lasts under an hour. By that point, you may well be seriously dehydrated and faint with exhaustion. Your phalanx and that of your enemy probably push forward and then get pushed back for a while, rather like in a tug of war. But eventually, one side begins to give way, whereupon a swift outcome will generally ensue. Most battles ended in a tactical victory. As the victors, you wouldn't have bothered to pursue the enemy. Instead, you're probably content to erect a trophy on the field of battle. Our word trophy comes from the Greek noun tropē, meaning turning point, since you erected your trophy at the place where your army gained the upper hand. So, the battle is over. Probably you've taken some prisoners and now they're exchanged. Now too comes the grisly task of disposing of your dead. If you've been defeated, it was still a pan-Hellenic law, an all-Greek law, that you could return to the battlefield and recover your dead. So by the standards of modern warfare, it's all rather civilized. That's because you're fighting against Greeks. It wouldn't be so civilized if you were fighting the Persians. One recent estimate is that typically 5% of the victorious army and 14% of the defeated army were killed in the fray. And that doesn't include the wounded, many of whom would have become permanently disabled as a result of their injuries. The Athenians generally cremated their dead on the battlefield and then brought their ashes back to Athens. And then at the end of the campaigning season, the ashes of all the war dead from all the campaigns fought that year were interred in 10 cypress wood coffins, one for each of the 10 tribes. And a man chosen by the demos, that's to say by the Athenian assembly, who was noted for his wisdom and his high reputation, as Thucydides puts it, delivered a funeral speech over them, like the one I quoted from earlier in the Kerameikos, Athens' principal cemetery. It was one of those rare occasions in the Athenian calendar when men, women, and children all assembled together. The Athenian statesman Pericles, who was chosen to give the speech on behalf of the dead who died in the first year of the Peloponnesian War, used it as an occasion to celebrate Athenian values, to give an account of what it was that Athenian soldiers were defending. The whole world, he said, is the grave of glorious men, andron epiphanon pasage taphos, meaning those who have died in battle. It's a wonderful way of expressing our debt to our soldiers. Only in exceptional circumstances did you inter your dead on the battlefield, as in the case of the 196 Athenians who died at Marathon in 490 BC, repulsing the Persians. You accorded them this honor because you judged their courage to have been heroic in the technical sense of the word. In other words, you regarded them as heroes and worshipped them accordingly. You buried them collectively at Marathon at the exact spot where most of them fell, and heaped a mound on top of them, and it remains to this day a very sacred spot. We don't know the size of the Athenian hoplite army at any period of history. Historians used to assume that most Greeks were either rich or poor. It's becoming increasingly apparent, however, that Athens at least had a sizable middle class, a class that supplied the hoplites. If you didn't have enough money to purchase a suit of armor, you probably volunteered to become a rower in an Athenian warship known as a trireme. Trireme derives from trieres, meaning three-fitted, a reference to its three banks or tiers of oars. The trireme has been aptly described as the greyhound of the seas. It was designed to achieve maximum speed and maneuverability with minimum weight. It accommodated 170 rowers, 10 hoplites, 4 archers, and 16 crew members, making a complement of 200. 2 square sails enabled it to take advantage of favourable winds. It was also tipped with a bronze ram so that it could sink enemy ships. We know a great deal about triremes thanks to John Coates, a naval architect who persuaded the Greek Ministry of Culture to build a full-scale replica trireme to a design that was not only faithful to the ancient testimony, but also consistent with the laws of physics. It was named the Olympias, and it was commissioned into the Greek Navy in June of 1987. It achieved a top speed of 8.9 knots and 46 strokes a minute. If, say, the trireme caught fire, the sailors could accomplish an emergency evacuation by jumping into the water in a mere 24 seconds. Or at least that's how long it took the volunteer rowers on the Olympias to jump overboard. Let's pass now to Sparta. Plutarch, in his Life of Lycurgus, memorably states that the Spartans belonged entirely to their country and not to themselves. Everything we know about Spartan society supports this claim, although it has to be acknowledged that almost all of what we know about Sparta was written by non-Spartan philosophers and historians, which means that we see Sparta entirely from the outside. As Plutarch tells us, at the age of 6, you were removed from the care of your parents and subjected to an extremely tough system of state education known as the agoge. Its objective was to instill obedience, discipline, and resourcefulness in you. I've talked about Sparta's educational system in the lecture about growing up Greek, so let's move on to the point where you hit 20, when you became liable for military service. And military service will now dominate every aspect of your life. You'll wear a distinctive scarlet cloak, allegedly to disguise your blood if you're wounded. And you'll have the letter lambda painted on your shield, indicating that you're a Lacedaemonian, the name by which Spartans were generally known. Even on your wedding night, you'll be permitted to spend only a short time with your bride before having to return to your barracks before dawn. And nothing could indicate more obviously your primary attachment to the state. At age 30, you'll finally become a full citizen, a homoios, meaning one who is equal. When you're not actually fighting, you're training, a state of affairs that prompted Plutarch to observe that the Spartans were the only Greeks for whom war was a welcome respite from the business of preparing for war. You'll finally be released from military obligations at the age of 60, though like many retired servicemen, by that point you'll probably feel more at home with your comrades in arms than you will with your family. All that training did, I suppose, pay off, sort of, at any rate. As a Spartan, you had the reputation, justifiably, for being the most courageous warriors of all the Greeks. Your reputation was secured for all time, of course, at the Battle of Thermopylae in August 480 BC, when 300 of you, under the command of your king Leonidas, defended the narrow pass at Thermopylae before being overwhelmed by the Persians. Herodotus tells us that when a scout sent by the Persian king Xerxes went to spy upon the Spartans, he found them brushing their hair. Spartan men wore their hair long. The Spartans always brushed their hair before they placed their lives at risk. How cool is that? Equally cool is the reply by Dianakes, one of the 300, to an observation by one of the locals that the Persians had so many arrows that they would block out the sun. Good, he said, that means we'll fight in the shade. The poet Simonides wrote this wonderful, restrained epigram to commemorate their sacrifice. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their law, we lie. It exactly captures the Spartan fighting spirit. And to this day, American and British soldiers serving in Afghanistan wear tattoos on their bodies that testify to their admiration for the 300. Yet, noble though the sacrifice of the Spartans was for the cause of Western civilization, the citing of it in the context of modern warfare is a stark reminder of the long shadow cast by interracial hatred. We'll be talking more about the East-West divide in a later lecture about life among the Persians, but it's worth noting here that its origins lie in the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. It was during this period, too, that the image of the dreaded and despised barbarian first came into being. Previously, there doesn't seem to have been any deeply embedded animosity between Greeks and Persians. What made the Persians so hateful in the eyes of the Athenians was the fact that they destroyed their temples on the Acropolis and smashed their grave markers. As a result of the Persian wars, therefore, the Greeks came to view the Persians as quintessentially the other, inferior to themselves in every way. I want next to talk about mercenaries, the soldiers who fought not for their country, but for pay. We already hear of mercenaries in the Greek world from around the second half of the 7th century onwards, and they may well have existed earlier. Until the end of the 5th century, however, they were relatively few in number, due to the fact that the city-states all depended on citizen militias for their protection, as I've pointed out. The only employers of mercenaries until then were tyrants and kings. It was the worsening economic conditions of Greece at the end of the Peloponnesian War that made being a mercenary an attractive job proposition. So what would have induced you to offer your services as a mercenary? Basically, the fact was that it afforded you a degree of security in an increasingly insecure world. If you were hale and hearty, had a taste for adventure, and didn't mind putting your life on the line, it had much to recommend it. Initially, mercenaries came from the poorer regions of Greece, such as Arcadia in the northern Peloponnese, where farming was an uphill struggle, or from outside the Greek world altogether, such as Thrace in the far north, many of whose people were so wretched that they sold their children into slavery. In time, however, men began enlisting as mercenaries from all over Greece, including from the leading city-states. Being a mercenary was a very demanding job. You'd need to be trained in a variety of techniques, as you never knew what sort of fighting you'd be asked to do. Engagements increasingly took place in rough terrain, which meant it wasn't enough to know how to fight as a hoplite. You'd have to know guerrilla tactics as well. You'd sign up to fight on a seasonal basis or for the duration of a specific campaign. We hear of recruitment centres at Cape Tainarum and Cape Malea, both at the southernmost tips of the Peloponnese. You wouldn't care who your paymaster happened to be, nor who you were fighting, just so long as the pay was good. And that was all that counted. In 401 BC, the Persian prince Cyrus hired more than 10,000 Greek mercenaries in an attempt to seize his brother's throne. Cyrus was wealthy, so the pay would have been good. People signed up from all over Greece. After Cyrus had been killed in battle, his mercenaries succeeded in making their way back from the Persian heartland to friendly territory without suffering serious losses. And in so doing, they had to cross deserts and negotiate mountain passes. Their journey is stirringly described by an Athenian general called Xenophon, who was one of their number in his Anabasis, or march up country. It proved the military superiority of Greek soldiers over barbarians and was a tremendous advertisement for their prowess and expertise. And from this point onwards, mercenaries gravitated to every theatre of war. Yet, despite their importance, as a mercenary, you'd be decidedly low down on the social scale. The Athenian orator and essayist Isocrates characterized you as the dregs of society. Writing in 380 BC, he defined you as persons who are either refugees, deserters, or criminals, and who follow anybody so long as he increases their income. Later, Isocrates warned his fellow countrymen that those who wander about without the means to support themselves and who assault all those they encounter are in danger of becoming so numerous without our realizing it that they will become as formidable as the barbarians once were. Isocrates is no doubt using scaremongering tactics for rhetorical effect, but the fact that he expected his scaremongering to work indicates that the Greeks were genuinely alarmed at the increase in the number of persons of no fixed abode. Because you were armed to the teeth and owed no allegiance other than to your paymaster, you'd be capable of dealing the death blow to Greek civilization as we know it. Or at least that is what Isocrates indicates. His hysterical hype is fully equal to the worst excesses of modern tabloid journalism. To conclude, the rise of the mercenary had profound implications for daily life in the Greek world. It meant that a sizable percentage of the Greek male population was uprooted and on the move. We don't know what specific consequences this had for the women who were left at home, but they must have been profound. In the next lecture, we're going to direct our attention specifically to the world of Greek women, to find out how they were perceived by men, what being in the home was like for them, and what alternatives there were to the traditional role of being wives and mothers.